What Remains After Love. Chapter 1. The House on Waverly Hill. The house stood at the edge of town, where the map gave up and the forest began. It was an old colonial, 3 stories of aging white paint and restless windows. From the road below, it looked dignified but weary, like someone who had once been remarkable and now kept mostly to themselves. Inside, the air held a faint sweetness, something between cedar and forgotten perfume. Dr. Thomas Hale paused in the entryway that first morning, one hand still on the doorframe, as if asking the house's permission to enter. He had not been here in nearly 20 years. He whispered to no one, "Well, here we are again." The sound of his voice disappeared quickly into the high ceilings. Thomas was 68, recently retired, though the words still felt foreign, like a borrowed coat that didn't fit quite right. For 40 years, he had taught literature at Emerson College, modern American fiction, his specialty. He could recite Cheever by heart, lecture on Carver without notes, and once wrote a paper titled The Architecture of Regret. Now, standing in this old house he'd inherited from his aunt, he thought about how regret had its own architecture indeed: rooms, corridors, and locked doors. He set his suitcase down near the stairs. The floorboards groaned under his weight, a slow and familiar protest. The house smelled exactly as he remembered: old books, varnish, and the ghost of coffee that had been brewed here decades ago. In the kitchen, the light was softer. The morning came in slanted beams through lace curtains, painting bright stripes on the table. A tin clock ticked quietly. Thomas filled a kettle, placed it on the stove, and listened to the sound of water coming to a boil. Small, ordinary music in a place that had been silent too long. He found a dusty mug in the cupboard. On it, faded letters spelled "World's Best Teacher." A gift, perhaps from a student, though he couldn't recall who. He smiled at the irony. The kettle began to hum. He poured the water, sat at the table, and let his mind wander. This house was supposed to be temporary, a place to rest, to write, maybe to remember. His niece, Emily, had insisted he take it. "It's good for you," she'd said. "Somewhere quiet, where no one calls you professor anymore." He had laughed at that, though something about it stung. Outside, the trees swayed in the early wind. Leaves scraped against the window glass. Thomas opened his laptop. Its glow filled the dim room. He clicked on a blank document. Title: The Last Season. He typed a sentence, then deleted it. Typed another. Deleted again. He sighed. "You're not helping, are you?" he said aloud, addressing either the screen or the house. No reply. He stood and walked to the back porch. The woods stretched out behind the house, dense, green, humming with hidden life. He remembered coming here as a boy, running through those same trees, shouting until his voice was swallowed by the forest. His aunt would call him back for supper, her voice echoing across the hill. He could still hear it. The crunch of gravel startled him. A car pulled into the narrow driveway. A silver Subaru, recent model. From it stepped a woman in her 40s, slim, wearing jeans and a dark blue sweater. She waved politely as she approached the porch. "Dr. Hale," she called out. He hesitated before answering. "Yes, and you are?" "I'm Claire. Claire Mercer. Your neighbor, sort of. Down the hill." "Ah, well, Claire Mercer, welcome to the Relic on Waverly Hill." She laughed, easy and warm. "I saw someone moving in yesterday. Thought I'd bring a proper hello." She handed him a paper bag that smelled unmistakably of cinnamon and butter. "Muffins. My mother's recipe." Thomas accepted the bag like an artifact. "That's kind of you. I wasn't expecting company this early in my hermitage." "I thought academics liked conversation," she teased. "Only when it's about other people's lives." That made her smile. She looked past him into the house. "It's beautiful in a lonely way. Must have a story." "Several," he said softly. "Most unfinished." She studied him for a second. "Well, maybe this is where you finish one." He didn't answer. By late afternoon, clouds had gathered. Rain began as a whisper and grew into steady applause on the roof. Thomas lit the small lamp by the window and sat with the book, though he barely read. He watched the rain slide down the glass instead. He had planned to write today. Instead, he found himself unpacking boxes labeled office. Folders, drafts, annotated papers. At the bottom of one, he found a thin envelope tied with twine. His handwriting. He untied it carefully. Inside was a letter dated 1998 from a woman named Margaret Lane. Tom, I wish I'd said this sooner. Some things can't wait a lifetime. Come to Waverly Hill before the first frost. You'll understand why. He stared at the signature, traced it with his thumb. Margaret Lane. He had not thought of her in years. He remembered their time vividly now. The faculty lounge, late lectures, her laughter that lingered even after she left the room. She had been a visiting poet for one semester, bright and impossible. Married, but restless. They had shared coffee, then long drives, then silence. He never came to Waverly Hill that autumn. He had told himself it was too complicated, too late, too foolish. Then she was gone, moved to Oregon, later to Europe. He heard she passed away in 2012. And yet here her letter was, as though it had waited for him all this time. The rain deepened, filling the silence with its rhythm. He folded the letter again, slower this time, and placed it on the table beside the laptop. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he opened a new document and began to type. October 4th. The house smells of rain and cinnamon. A letter has found me. Or perhaps I have found it. Either way, the past has impeccable timing. He paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. There was a sound behind him, a soft creak on the floorboards above. He froze. The house had many noises, he reminded himself. Old wood, shifting air. Still, that sound, measured, deliberate, made him turn. He stood and listened. Another creak, then silence. He walked to the base of the stairs and looked up. The second floor was dark. Hello, he called. His voice sounded strange, too loud. Nothing. But then, faintly, the smell of lavender drifted down the hall. He knew that scent. Margaret's perfume. Thomas stood very still. The air seemed to hold its breath. He climbed the stairs, each step careful, deliberate. At the top landing, moonlight spilled through a high window, pale and uncertain. The hallway stretched long and narrow, lined with doors that hadn't been opened in years. He followed the scent. It led him to the room at the far end, the study his aunt used to keep locked. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. The window was open, curtains moving gently in the breeze. On the desk lay a small book, leather-bound. Its cover faded to gray. Thomas crossed the room, feeling an odd weight in his chest. He reached for the book and opened it. Inside, the first page read, "For TH, when you finally return." His heart stumbled in his chest. He turned another page. There, in a handwriting he hadn't seen in decades, were the first lines of a poem. "The wind remembers what we choose to forget. The door you never opened still waits for you." He read the lines twice, 3 times. Outside, the rain stopped. The forest beyond the window was dark and still. He closed the book, his hands trembling slightly. For a long while, he simply stood there, surrounded by the quiet weight of the past. Finally, he whispered, "All right, Margaret. I'm listening." When he came downstairs again, the clock in the kitchen read midnight. The air had cooled. He poured himself a glass of water, set it beside the letter, and stared at both, the living and the written proof that something in his life wasn't finished yet. He sat down, opened the laptop, and began to write once more. This time, the words didn't stop. Outside, a single light still burned in the house on Waverly Hill. Inside, an old man began the story he should have written years ago, one about memory, unfinished love, and the way silence can keep a heart alive far longer than sound. Upstairs, unseen, a curtain stirred once more. And faintly, so faintly it could have been imagination, the scent of lavender lingered in the air. Chapter 2. The Letter in Lavender. Morning arrived quietly on Waverly Hill. A low fog clung to the trees, softening their outlines until everything looked like a faded photograph. Inside, the house felt different, still old, still heavy with memory, but faintly aware, as if it, too, had begun to listen. Thomas woke early. He hadn't meant to, but sleep had been thin, restless. The image of the book, Margaret's book, hovered in his mind all night. For when you finally return. He sat at the kitchen table, robe loosely tied, a mug of coffee cooling beside his laptop. The light outside was gray and slow, the kind of light that made everything honest. He opened the small leather-bound book again. The pages were delicate, the ink faint but readable. Most entries were short, half poems, fragments, thoughts written in haste. Some ended mid-sentence, as if interrupted. On the third page, one line caught him. Letters are only true when unread. Once opened, they start lying. He smiled sadly. That was Margaret, clever, fatalistic, never sentimental on the surface. And yet she'd written to him, and she had waited. Around 9, a knock came at the door. He hesitated before answering, unsure whether he wanted company or silence. When he finally opened it, Claire stood there again, holding a notebook and a paper cup from the cafe in town. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, smiling. "You seemed new to the area. I figured caffeine diplomacy might help." Thomas stepped aside. "You're dangerously kind for a neighbor." "I'm also nosy," she admitted, entering. "My mother used to live near here. We'd walk these hills when I was little." She looked around, eyes taking in the books piled on the table, the open laptop, the cup with the fading world's best teacher lettering. "Writing something?" she asked. "Trying to. Fiction." He hesitated. "Something between fiction and confession." She nodded as if that made perfect sense. "That's usually the interesting kind." They sat for a while, the easy silence of near strangers who understand boundaries instinctively. Claire was a music teacher at the local community college, she explained. Early 40s, recently divorced, recently relocated. "I figured a quiet town might give me time to think," she said. "Turns out, thinking's overrated." Thomas chuckled. "You sound like someone who's lived through academia." 16 years, she said. "I survived the wars of curriculum committees." That made him laugh outright. It felt good, the first genuine laugh in months. Then she noticed the leather book beside his laptop. "May I?" He hesitated. Then, softly, "It's personal. Someone I used to know. A love story?" "Not exactly," he said. "More like the echo of one." She nodded, not pressing further. Echoes have their own kind of beauty. After she left, Thomas walked to the study again. The smell of lavender was faint but persistent, woven into the wood. He sat by the desk, opened the book once more. A few loose sheets were tucked between the pages, letters, folded carefully, yellowed at the edges. His initials were on the first envelope. He hesitated before opening it, almost expecting it to vanish if he touched it. But it didn't. The handwriting was unmistakable. Margaret's. "Tom, if you're reading this, I suppose you finally came back. I don't know what that means for you, or for me, or for whatever is left of us in the air between these walls. But I want you to understand something. Silence was never indifference. It was mercy. I thought I was sparing you. Maybe I was only sparing myself. This house knows what I couldn't say aloud. It remembers what I couldn't destroy. There's another letter, hidden, not far. You'll find it when you're ready to forgive me, or yourself. Either will do. M." He read it twice. The words trembled faintly on the page, as if they, too, were afraid of what they meant. Thomas leaned back in the chair. The rain from the night before had left the world clean and glistening, but inside him, a storm had started to form. "Another letter," he whispered. "Hidden." The idea felt absurd and intimate at once. By afternoon, the fog had lifted. The forest outside was radiant with new green, the air sharp with pine and wet soil. Thomas needed air. He walked the narrow path behind the house, one hand brushing the rough bark of the trees. He tried to remember the way things had looked decades ago, before careers, before regret had built its walls. There was a stone bench near the edge of the woods, half buried in ivy. His aunt had kept it there for years, a place for afternoon thinking, she'd called it. He sat. The air was cool and filled with birdsong. From here, the house looked small, almost peaceful. He wondered how many times Margaret had stood here, waiting, hoping he'd come. He pulled the letter from his pocket and read it again. The phrase hidden, not far, looped in his mind like a melody. He glanced around. The garden was overgrown, the shed half collapsed, the ground littered with the first fallen leaves of October. Then something caught his eye, a corner of wood beneath the bench, where the earth had slightly shifted. He knelt, brushed away the soil. Beneath it lay a small box, metal tarnished with age. His heart beat faster. He lifted it carefully. It wasn't locked. Inside, wrapped in yellow ribbon, was another envelope. He opened it with trembling hands. "Tom, by now, you've likely done what I never dared," returned. "I don't know what your life became after you chose to stay away. Mine became quieter, lonelier, but not empty. Some loves aren't meant to be lived, only remembered. Still, I kept hoping you'd come back, if only once. Not for me, but for yourself. To see how memory changes shape, how forgiveness smells faintly of lavender. If you're reading this, then perhaps you've forgiven something, or nothing at all. Either way, thank you for coming back to finish the silence. Margaret." He sat for a long time after reading. The woods were perfectly still. Somewhere in the distance, a single crow called. He felt an ache, not sharp, not painful, but deep and wide, like a space that had finally been recognized. That evening, Claire returned. She brought soup this time, insisting that writers forget to eat. They sat by the kitchen window, the lamp between them casting a gentle circle of light. "You look different," she said after a while. "Peaceful, maybe." "I found something today," he said. "A letter. From someone who's gone. Someone important." "Yes." "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. He looked out the window at the darkened trees. "I used to. Now I think regret is just love that's been waiting too long." She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The rain began again, gentle, unhurried. Later, when he was alone, Thomas sat by the desk and began to type once more. This time, the story wasn't fiction. It began simply. Once, a man returned to the house he had left behind and found that love had been waiting for him, not in memory, but in ink. He paused, listening to the rain. Somewhere upstairs, a faint creak. Not alarming, almost comforting. He looked toward the staircase, then back to his screen. Some letters never stop being written, he typed. They only wait for the right silence to be read. The clock struck 11. The wind stirred the curtains. And faintly, very faintly, the scent of lavender drifted through the house again. Thomas smiled, almost imperceptibly, and whispered, "Good night, Margaret." Chapter 3. Echoes by the Lake. The lake lay 2 miles east of Waverly Hill, a long oval of water edged by pines and willows that leaned close, as though whispering into its stillness. Thomas had not been there since he was a boy. Back then, the lake had seemed enormous, an entire world hidden behind the woods. Now, as he walked along the path that wound between moss and roots, it felt smaller but somehow deeper, like a memory revisited too late. He carried a notebook under his arm, not his laptop. He wanted paper, something that could breathe. The morning air was sharp with the smell of rain-soaked leaves, and the sound of his footsteps folded neatly into the hush of the forest. He reached the shore just as the light changed. The fog that had lingered since dawn lifted in a slow unraveling, and the surface of the water shone with a fragile calm. He stood there a while, doing nothing, letting the quiet settle around him. Margaret had mentioned the lake once, long ago. They'd been talking after a department reception, both a little drunk, both pretending not to be sentimental. She'd said, "If I ever disappear, that's where I'll go, to a place that listens but never answers." Now, standing at the edge, Thomas understood what she had meant. He opened his notebook and wrote a few words. Not about Margaret, not directly, but about sound, about reflection, about the way water remembers what it touches. He wrote, "Some echoes don't fade. They move farther away until you realize they're coming from inside you." He paused. The phrase startled him. It didn't sound like something he'd written. It sounded like something he'd been told. And then he heard footsteps. He turned. Claire stood behind him, holding a thermos and a scarf knotted loosely around her neck. "I had a feeling I'd find you here," she said. He smiled, slightly embarrassed. "Am I that predictable?" "Only to someone who also walks to think," she said, handing him the thermos. "Tea. I'm trying to save you from caffeine poisoning." They sat on the damp bench near the shore. The air between them was easy again, warm in its quiet. After a while, she asked, "Have you found what you came here for?" Thomas looked at the water. "Not yet, but I think I'm getting close." "To Margaret?" He nodded. "She's still here, isn't she?" Claire said softly. "In a way," he replied. "In letters, in scent, in the way this place feels different since I arrived." Claire looked at him, studying the lines in his face. "You talk about her as if she never really left." He smiled faintly. "Maybe people like her never do." The afternoon unfolded in gentle silence. Claire told him stories about her students, about the oddness of small-town life, about how she'd once dreamed of becoming a concert pianist. Thomas listened, grateful for the sound of another person's life. When the sun began to lower, he said, "Would you mind if I told you something strange?" "Please do. Those are my favorite kinds of stories." He took a breath. "The other night, I heard someone walking upstairs. Then I smelled lavender, the same scent Margaret used to wear." Claire didn't look surprised. "Old houses hold memories," she said. "They seep into the wood. Sometimes they leak back out." "It felt more alive than memory," he said quietly, like she was still trying to speak. Claire tilted her head. "Maybe she is. Maybe the question is, what do you need to say back?" Thomas let the question hang in the air. That evening, back at the house, he sat in the study again. The small book still lay on the desk, its pages slightly curled from the damp. He began reading it from the beginning this time, slowly, letting each fragment breathe. Many of the pages were dated in the late 90s, the same autumn he should have come here. One entry read, "The lake was still today. I imagined his reflection there instead of mine. Perhaps that's what love is, looking into water and seeing someone else's face." Another, "I dreamt of the classroom again." His voice explaining frost. "The road not taken is a wish disguised as philosophy." I wanted to tell him that sometimes the road not taken still finds you. Thomas closed the book and rubbed his eyes. He felt both humbled and exposed. The woman he had known so briefly had seen through him entirely. He returned to the lake the next day, driven by something between duty and longing. The weather had turned bright, the sky wide and coldly blue. Near the bench, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A small wooden sign half sunk in the earth, its lettering faint. ML, 1955 to 2012. His breath caught. A memorial. Simple, almost hidden. Someone, perhaps her family, had placed it here years ago. He knelt before it, brushing the dirt away from the letters. "So this is where you went," he said quietly, "where you wanted to disappear." He sat there for a long time, the wind stirring the surface of the lake into small, silver ripples. Finally, he pulled a page from his notebook and began to write. Not for publication. Not for anyone else. Just a letter. "Dear Margaret, I read your words. All of them. The letters, the poems, even the ones you didn't finish. You were right. I stayed away too long. I told myself it was because life was complicated, but maybe I was just afraid of what silence would reveal. Now I know, silence doesn't erase love. It keeps it waiting. If you can still hear me, know this. I forgave you the moment I saw your handwriting again. And maybe, in forgiving you, I've finally forgiven myself." He folded the page, placed it under the small memorial stone, and set a flat pebble on top to hold it. The wind shifted then. The smell of lavender brushed faintly across the air. He closed his eyes. For a moment, he could almost feel her near. a presence neither cold nor sorrowful, but tender, like light passing through leaves. That night, when he returned home, the house felt warmer, the corners softer, the air lighter. He poured himself a small glass of wine and sat by the window. The reflection in the glass showed a man older than he remembered, but not alone. A message pinged on his phone. "Claire, the lake okay?" He smiled, typed back, "Yes." It listens better than most people. A pause. Then her reply, "Tomorrow night, concert at the college. Come, you could use some sound after all that silence." He looked at the screen for a long time, then typed, "I'll be there." Later, before bed, he went to the study once more. The small leather book lay closed on the desk. He touched its cover gently. "Thank you," he whispered. And for the first time since arriving, there was no answering creak, no whisper of lavender. Just peace. Outside, the trees swayed under the stars. The lake shimmered in the distance, holding its quiet promise. Inside the house on Waverly Hill, Thomas Hale finally slept, dreamless, steady, forgiven. Chapter 4: The Season of Return. Autumn deepened on Waverly Hill. The trees flared gold, then rust, then the color of old paper. Each morning brought a new pattern of leaves across the porch, as if the forest itself were writing him letters, brief, bright ones, meant to be read before the wind took them away. Thomas noticed the season more keenly now. The air had the smell of wood smoke and endings, the kind of weather that invited remembering. He still wrote every morning, though his pages had grown gentler, less about regret and more about what it meant to stay. And that evening, as promised, he drove into town for Claire's concert. The auditorium at the college was small, intimate, with a low stage and rows of worn velvet seats. The lights were soft, the chatter low and comfortable. He found a place near the back, content to watch unseen. On stage, a grand piano gleamed under the lights. When Claire appeared, the murmurs quieted. She wore a simple black dress, hair pinned loosely, the kind of grace that didn't ask to be noticed but was anyway. She sat, adjusted the bench, and began to play. The first notes drifted into the air, clear, deliberate, like a confession whispered in public. The music filled the room, then softened, then rose again in a tide of sound that seemed to move through everyone at once. Thomas closed his eyes. He didn't know the piece, but he knew the feeling. It was longing without despair, grief without bitterness. It was memory finding its way back home. And somewhere in those notes, he thought he heard something else. Margaret's laughter, faint and far away, blending with the music like a familiar echo. When the final chord faded, no one clapped right away. The silence afterward felt sacred, as though the room needed to breathe before remembering itself. Then applause rose, warm and grateful. Claire looked up, smiled slightly, and her eyes, searching the crowd, found his. Just for a moment. Afterward, they walked together through the quiet campus. The air was cool, filled with the smell of damp leaves. The moon hung low, bright as a coin. "You play like someone writing a story," he said. "I suppose I am," she replied. "Every piece is a conversation I didn't finish." "That's what writing is too," he said. "A way to answer ghosts." She smiled, tucking her scarf tighter around her neck. "Did you ever find what Margaret wanted you to?" He hesitated. "I found her letters, her words, her peace, and in a strange way, I found something of myself. She must have meant a lot. She still does. But it's different now. It's not pain anymore. It's gratitude." Claire nodded, then said quietly, "My mother used to talk about a woman named Margaret Lane. They taught together for a while, years ago. She said she was brilliant but lonely. I didn't realize until recently she lived up here too." Thomas stopped walking. The night seemed to still around them. "Your mother knew her?" "Yes. They stayed in touch for a while. After she passed, my mother brought me to the lake once. There's a small plaque there. You've probably seen it. I didn't know until then that Margaret had asked for her ashes to be scattered there." Thomas swallowed. The world felt smaller suddenly, like a circle quietly closing. She never mentioned that. Claire looked at him carefully. Maybe she didn't need to. Maybe she knew someone else would come to say goodbye. They reached the edge of the parking lot. The street lamps flickered through the leaves. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Claire said, "You could come by tomorrow. I've been restoring an old piano. It needs a listener." "I'd like that," he said. And he meant it. That night, back in the house, Thomas sat by the window again. The forest beyond was alive with sound. The rustle of leaves, the call of distant owls. He poured a small drink, raised it toward the darkness. "To you, Margaret," he said quietly, "and to whatever this new season brings." The wind answered softly through the cracks in the window. No lavender this time, only the clean scent of rain on wood. He smiled. It felt like permission. The next morning brought light, golden and thin, slipping between the branches. Thomas drove down to Claire's house at the bottom of the hill. It was a smaller place, newer, with bright windows and the faint hum of life. Inside, the piano stood near the front room, half open, its keys gleaming. Claire motioned for him to sit. "I'm working on a piece," she said. "It's something I started years ago and never finished." He nodded. "Then maybe today's the day." She smiled and began to play. It was slow, deliberate, hesitant at first, like a letter being written in sound. Then, gradually, it opened, expanding into something full and clear. Thomas closed his eyes again. For the first time in years, he felt not haunted but accompanied. When she finished, the silence that followed was complete, not empty. "That," he said quietly, "was beautiful. It's called The Season of Return," she said. "My mother told me the name once. Said it was something Margaret used to say when the leaves turned." He smiled. Of course it was. That evening, when he came home, Thomas placed Margaret's book back in the desk drawer and closed it. Not as an ending, but as a resting place. He opened his laptop and began to type again, but this time the words came easily. Some stories don't end. They change season. They find new voices to carry the melody forward. He paused, then added, "Love, in the end, isn't what remains after everything else. It's what keeps returning in different forms until we finally listen." He leaned back, listening to the soft hum of the house, to the wind outside, to the faint memory of music drifting through his thoughts. And for the first time, the quiet didn't feel like absence. It felt like home. Outside, autumn kept writing its slow farewell across the hill. Inside, Thomas Hale began the second half of his life, not with longing, but with readiness. And somewhere near the lake, carried gently on the wind, the last echo of lavender faded into the season's turning light. Epilogue: the light beyond Waverly Hill. The years softened everything. The house on Waverly Hill still stood, though the paint had faded to a gentler shade, and ivy now climbed the porch rails in patient spirals. The forest around it had thickened, the path to the lake narrower, as if nature itself were drawing the story closer to its heart. Inside, the rooms were full again, not with ghosts, but with quiet, ordinary life. Books stacked neatly, mugs beside notebooks, a vase of fresh flowers always on the kitchen table. Thomas Hale, now 75, moved slower these days, but he moved with purpose. He still rose early, still brewed his coffee the old way, still listened to the first sounds of morning like they were sentences being written just for him. The manuscript he'd started that first autumn, What Remains After Love, had become a book, published quietly by a small press. He hadn't expected much, but it had found its way into classrooms, book clubs, and the hearts of people who thought they were long past the age of being moved by love stories. He received letters sometimes, real letters, written by hand. One reader had written, "You reminded me that forgiveness has a scent. I think mine smells like rain." That one he kept folded in his desk drawer beside Margaret's old book. Claire had become part of his life in the way spring becomes part of winter. Not suddenly, but unmistakably. They never named what they were. They didn't need to. Companionship, affection, laughter, shared silence. Each had its place, and each was enough. She taught music at the college still, though she'd recently started composing again. Together, they had begun a project, a small performance series called Echoes by the Lake. She played. He read excerpts from his book. It drew small crowds. Locals came, a few students, a few curious travelers. Each time, as the sun dipped over the water and the light turned amber, they performed beneath the open sky. The sound of her piano and his voice carried gently across the lake, mingling with the breeze and the rustling pines. People often told them afterward that it felt less like a concert and more like a memory returning. On one late September evening, after their final performance of the season, Thomas lingered by the water as the audience drifted away. The air was cool, full of the scent of pine and smoke. Claire came up beside him, hands in her coat pockets. "You read that last passage differently tonight," she said. He smiled. "Maybe I finally understood it." She tilted her head. "Which part?" He looked out across the still lake, its surface catching the last gold of daylight. "Love doesn't vanish. It just changes address." She smiled. "That sounds like something Margaret would have written." "Maybe she did," he said softly. The two of them stood there a long while, watching the light fade, neither speaking. The water reflected everything: sky, trees, memory, until it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Later, back at the house, Thomas opened the old drawer one last time. He took out Margaret's book, its leather now soft with age. He thumbed through the pages slowly, then stopped at a line he hadn't noticed before, written faintly on the inside back cover, as if added in a hurry. "When the music finds you, let it carry me too." He smiled, closed the book, and slipped it into a small wooden box along with his fountain pen, the world's best teacher mug, and the letter from the reader who'd written about rain. He carried the box to the porch. The evening wind brushed against his face. The forest whispered. "Thank you," he said, quietly, "to all of it. To the woman who once wrote him letters, to the music still playing below the hill, to the house that had kept its promise of silence and return." The next morning, Claire found the box on the porch table, a note on top in his steady handwriting. "For the next season. Keep what you wish, let the rest drift." She smiled through tears she didn't try to hide. The house behind her was still, but warm with the echo of his presence, his words, his patience, his quiet way of loving the world. She looked out toward the trees, toward the shimmer of water beyond. The wind moved gently through the pines. Somewhere, faintly, the scent of lavender rose and disappeared. That spring, Echoes by the Lake continued. Claire played, and a student read from Thomas's writings. Each year, the crowd grew. And each time, as dusk fell over Waverly Hill, the same moment came. A hush, a pause, a breath before the final note. In that stillness, everyone could feel it. Not sorrow, not loss, but something vast and tender. The quiet truth that what remains after love is never emptiness, but the echo that keeps returning, softly, beautifully, from the far side of time.